Hi, my name is Julia Moore, and I'm the Senior Director at the Center for Implementation. Today, I'm going to talk about how we can accelerate the implementation of evidence by having core competencies specifically for implementation practice. So, the purpose of what we're doing here is really to help build a set of competencies for implementation practitioners. These people who are responsible for actually designing, implementing, spreading, and scaling interventions. The goal is not to build competencies for implementation science, but to use that science to inform how implementation support practitioners actually practice. So, in order to do that, we really need to make sure that the competencies include these two broad domains of activities: designing interventions for implementation, really selecting those implementation strategies, and planning for implementation, spread, and scale. So, in order to do this, we really want to highlight where this fits kind of in the spectrum of other work that's happening. We see dissemination and implementation as a spectrum. We have the practice of dissemination, really sharing information, raising awareness and knowledge that should ideally be informed by the science of dissemination. And then we have the practice of implementation, using strategies to change people's behavior that should ideally be informed by the science of implementation. Unfortunately, we know that that's often not the case. And so by building core competencies for implementation practitioners based on the science of implementation, we can kind of work towards having better quality implementation. So what does it mean to use implementation science to inform practice? Well, it means using theories, models, frameworks, and approaches to guide what it is that we are doing. So those process models that outline the steps or stages, theories that tell us about the mechanism of change, frameworks that help us capture the different factors that affect something, and approaches, which we use as a catch-all term for other things like implementation strategies and tools that people might use. And remember that I talked about how we want to make sure that implementation support practitioners can both design interventions for implementation and support implementation, spread, and scale. So when we talk about designing for implementation, we really mean being able to select implementation strategies, or the how, based on evidence and theory, so that they tap into the underlying barriers of why people may or may not make changes based on the evidence for what it is we want them to do differently. We also want our implementation efforts to be informed by the science of implementation on that implementation, spread, and scale side. So making sure that we are really understanding the context in which implementation is happening, that we're looking at implementation quality or fidelity. How well are we actually implementing the interventions? So to make sure that we captured this full spectrum, our methods included first scanning both published and gray literature for competencies. We then had 2 analysts review and do a content analysis. And then we thematically grouped this list into these activities, which were broader constructs, and then core competencies within those activities. We identified 6 competency documents. And so if you are interested in competency documents, some of these are really great. For example, I would really like to highlight the first one, which is very, very strong, particularly on that implementation end of the spectrum. So this is the source for all the different competencies we pulled together. And we pulled them into a report, which you can download and access here. We ended up finding 9 different activities and grouped the competencies within those. So I'm going to go through and kind of highlight some of the competencies that came out in each of these different activities. So first, we had inspiring stakeholders and developing relationships. So we know that it's really important for implementation support practitioners to be able to actively listen and build strong and trusting relationships. So we actually had 7 different competencies that came out within this specific activity. The next activity is about building implementation teams. We know that the work of implementation is rarely done by one person. This is a team sport. And ultimately, implementation support practitioners often need to help people build implementation teams and help them function effectively. So we have 5 competencies specific to building and supporting implementation teams. For example, encouraging a shared purpose, managing conflict, exploring power dynamics. Next, it is very important that we have a deep understanding of the problem when we're implementing, both when we design and actually implement interventions. So we have 3 different core competencies related to understanding the problem, making sure we use data and critically reflect on what is happening. Next, we want to make sure we're using evidence to inform all aspects of implementation. So we have 3 more competencies related to things like synthesizing and appraising evidence and being able to use evidence, for example, maybe to adapt programs or practices. More activities related to assessing the context. So here we have 4 more competencies. For example, understanding readiness, understanding contextual fit, being able to assess context, climate, culture. So these are really, really key to actually implementing, spreading, and scaling interventions. Then we have facilitating implementation. There are 7 competencies that map to this specific activity. That's because a huge part of the role of implementation support practitioners is often to facilitate implementation. So using process models and frameworks, identifying champions, motivating leaders, developing action plans, doing quality improvement cycles. So there's a lot of different activities that fall under this bucket. Then we have evaluation. So we have 2 competencies here. And sometimes we'll note here that I want to highlight not one person is necessarily responsible for all of these things. Remember, we talked about how implementation is a bit of a team sport. And so the same person who might be developing an implementation team might not be the evaluator, but that overall, you want to make sure you have people on your team who have all of these different competencies. So under evaluation, we really have 2 of them here. One of them about making sure you're using a framework and making sure that you are assessing implementation quality as well, that fidelity piece, are people implementing as intended. Next, we have sustainability and planning for sustainability, where we have 3 more competencies related to building capacity, assessing the factors that predict sustainability, and then actually developing a sustainability plan. Finally, sometimes implementation support practitioners need to broker knowledge. They might need to foster partnerships and leverage opportunities and encourage evidence-based decision-making. So overall, these are the 9 activities and 37 competencies that we identified and kind of mapped and grouped together that people can use to inform their implementation practice efforts. This is really the foundation. There's a lot of future work that needs to happen. We need to be building capacity in implementation practice. So both on professional development side for people who are already working and in training programs for people who are entering the workforce, for example, through master's programs. We've been spending a lot of time in the past year building out online courses for this purpose, and we know that there's lots of other groups that are doing work in this area as well. So that is a great move forward. But we also need to be building measures to evaluate fidelity to these core competencies. And we need to evaluate capacity building and whether these really are the right competencies in the first place. I want to say a huge thank you. I hope you have questions for us now, and you can also reach out to us afterwards related to the competencies and how you can use them to inform your own practice efforts. Thank you so much.